Hi guys, welcome back to another week of Art Life. In this week's episode, we are talking about watercolours.
I'm Jessie. I've been a full-time artist for 10 years and thought it about time I start sharing my painting techniques and adventures. Subscribe to join me every week for a window into my art life.
So for those of you who were watching last week, I mentioned that Michael Harding, the oil paint company that I love to use and who I am an ambassador for, are launching some fantastic new watercolours, and I still haven't tried them, so I'm going to be experimenting with them in this week's episode, and they literally look like the perfect little tube of paint. So we're going to be playing with watercolours and also going into a bit about the history. So when I think about watercolours, my mind instantly associates them with several hundred years of English painting history. I typically think of watercolours as quite a kind of British tradition, but the origins actually lie in Northern Europe. Hundreds of years worth of kind of evidence that gum arabics, pigments made from vegetable earths, natural pigments, were bound with egg. They were applied to vellum, they adorned manuscripts. You can see evidence of a kind of form of watercolour really hundreds and hundreds of years ago, maybe even thousands, but then we're kind of going more into just pigment rather than watercolour specifically, and I want to talk about watercolour specifically today. So watercolour itself is basically colour mixed with an opaque substance. In history, to give it a kind of chromatic intensity and bodily feel of substance, it might have been mixed with maybe a stack lead white. You really see in the 17th century in manuscripts particularly this kind of form of medium worked perfectly on a kind of papyrus for manuscripts, etc. It had a lighter, more delicate quality than maybe oil, which, as you know, as we've spoken about in previous episodes, has a tendency to go everywhere. We see in French history gouache. Oh no, it's gone weird. Gouache. Anyway, that's kind of where the French painting really kind of takes off in the kind of when I was looking at the history. And maybe even egg tempera when you think about early fresco painting into plaster, that, you know, oil wouldn't have been used. This kind of early form of watercolour is where we see painting being much more adaptable and flexible for different uses. So in 1534, Hans Boll sets up a school in Germany where he incorporates a kind of study of watercolour as part of the curriculum. I remember Henry VIII was always very fond of Holbein's watercolour studies, more like miniatures. I think Hilliard as well was well known for these European, more delicate, watery studies, less richer and denser than maybe the oil paintings of the time. They have a luminous quality, and as paper was starting to get a lot more sophisticated, watercolour could then advance with the development of that medium. Anyone who's ever used watercolour, bad paper ruins a good painting. So having a good, strong watercolour base that you're working on, whether it's a strong paper, it's definitely a must, but we'll talk a little bit more about that side of watercolour later. It's a very flexible medium. I know that it's kind of most famously associated with topographic art, which is to say map makers and artists who would accompany explorers. Maybe even on the Grand Tour, artists would use watercolour to kind of make huge volumes of almost geographical mementos for tourists to take home with them. Because watercolour, it dries fast. Now, the fast drying nature of watercolour is kind of why it is so popular for travellers and map makers. It's also very popular for a kind of cartoon, a coloured tinted cartoon for artists when they want to work through ideas quickly and not just in kind of charcoal or pencil. You know, they want to kind of create a sense of subtlety and maybe play around with different ideas for colour palettes. Watercolour lets you do this in a way which means that you don't have to faff around with pigment which doesn't dry. You can just be on the move, and in 20 minutes sometimes a small drawing can be completely dry, which is also why plein air work with watercolour, particularly in the romantic part of landscape history, when artists started to take to the landscape to explore nature, watercolour was a favourite medium. So when you talk about romantic landscape painting in 1790, this is when the watercolour revolution arrives in British history. It was Turner and Thomas Girton who basically started to establish that watercolours didn't just have to be sketchbook pieces, they could be final pieces, they could be framed. They used to say that, the frame was the artist's reward, that suddenly something that was only associated with maybe a sketch suddenly was actually a finished piece of work. If you're interested in this subject, I am going to be leaving relevant links to my research at the bottom of this video, but also books, which I found particularly useful when I was researching watercolour. The golden age of watercolour and the Tate book, the gallery, the Tate, lessons from the masters of watercolour are two really helpful books. Also, there's lots of books on just watercolour, a history. I will link them all in with the articles below. Again, Turner, Corot, Ruskin, Paul Sandby, and obviously Girton. These are just key artists who start to bring watercolour into this feeling of a final piece. It's an established artwork. My favourite watercolour painting is actually John Singer Sargent's The White Ships, mainly because it has such a sense of light. It holds light and shadow so beautifully, but the funny thing is with watercolour, you cannot overwork it. If you do, the colours all go murky and sometimes the paper just disintegrates. You have to be so confident about your brushstrokes and so sure of what you're doing that sometimes maybe the leniency of oil painting, how you can keep working it and reworking it, it's so forgiving. Watercolour is not forgiving. You have to know what you're doing and execute it confidently. So when you see a really good watercolour, I think that's when it really stands out for the artist's talent. So back to the history. In the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge arrival of new pigments thanks to the kind of thriving textile industry and all of these new dyes that were coming out. There was actually a treatise with the arrival of the popularity of watercolour, particularly in the 18th century. In 1731, there was instructions for making the perfect ivory cased kind of portable watercolour kit with 32 compartments for paints, spaces for brushes. Turner modified it slightly and used leather rather than like beautiful mahogany. We kind of have lost that a bit now. We don't sort of tend to have these kind of beautiful, old-fashioned, very Victoriana, I guess, ways of storing our paints. I just put all my paints in like a jar or a bucket, and when I'm traveling with them in like a tote bag. What would Turner think of my tote bag? But basically, watercolour wouldn't have been in maybe the tins we have now. They would have been cake sticks, which you would then grind down on a ceramic or porcelain mixing surface to kind of loosen the pigment. And then that's how you could kind of make your paints portable. In the Victorian era, when they started commercialising these kind of artist kits with watercolours, they actually sold 11 million of these between 1853 and 1870, which just shows you how many people were starting to kind of feel like they could paint in an amateur way, not just in a way which was only for professionals. So this is largely thanks to this revived popularity and establishment of the watercolour tradition, with the Royal Academy in 1768 creating the Royal Society of Watercolourists, which still is alive today. And I know Mal Galleries annually put a national competition out to watercolourists across the country to submit to exhibitions. There's still such a prevalent kind of culture with watercolour in England and globally as well. That's another important thing. It's not just the British tradition with watercolourists. Exceeding the confines of this maybe quite particular style of watercolour painting. In France at the same time, French Eugène Delacroix was doing amazing things with watercolour. You have these huge lithographs that he was doing. You have maybe satirical portrait cartoons that Honoré Daumier was doing, Kandinsky later on, although he was Russian and French, but still, France loved watercolour. I think also USA, I mentioned Singer Sargent as one of my favourite watercolourists. Across the pond, later on, the Americans really did start to bring watercolour much more into their practice. They were still using the Asiatic Martin brushes, which are the kind of watercolour brushes like Russian sable, where they're quite pointy at the end and they give you kind of a lovely volume when you paint. But it was more in the much more expressive use of the watercolour, maybe a lot freer. Still, these kind of cakes of watercolour were still very popular, but you see more and more the arrival of maybe a a tin of watercolors which you can paint with. Nowadays you actually have pencils which you add water to. It's like aquarelle in Italian. You basically just draw and then you add water and it turns into paint. It is amazing. The things we have now, we don't even realise how grateful we should be or how lucky we are to have all of these things available to us now. When you see the lengths people had to go through to kind of have these mediums back in the day. Other artists I think of when I think of watercolour, Roth Whistler, Georgia O'Keeffe, key artists who use watercolour as a significant part of their practice. I think after, you know, now we're talking like 19th century, 20th century, artists have now been using a lot more reductive techniques, sandpaper, sponges to kind of extract if they've overworked something with watercolour. No longer was it a case of just applying it. Now people were trying to experiment with different effects to kind of reduce maybe watercolour a little bit as well. I think putting sand on the watercolour was also quite a popular one when anyone was at a beach painting, they'd add sand if they'd overworked it, because it's not like you're using pencil and you can use a rubber. I mean, I think for me, the key parts of this research that have been so interesting isn't just the artists themselves, it's the kind of creators of the mediums we use. James Whitman made wove paper in 1780, which was this adding gelatin to the surface and then removing it, and then it's like sizing it essentially, and in sizing you're kind of reworking and creating the surface to absorb pigment but also repel it enough that it doesn't destroy the surface. And I would never have thought about stuff like this. I'd have just gone to watercolour and used it, whereas now I think I really appreciate the kind of lovely watercolour papers and all this stuff I have in my studio. It had a journey, you know, it has a story too, which is why I like doing these little bits of history. But enough about the history, let's get into the actual practical side of the episode, where I've got the paper ready, the new watercolours I'm so excited to try, because I actually have only ever really used kind of tins of watercolour. I'm really excited to use these amazing new watercolour from Michael Harding. So let's get the paper ready and see what we can do with them. So this is actually my latest painting that I've been working on in the studio. For those of you who have been following my Instagram at Jess Oliver Art, you'll see kind of my studio updates with oil painting in the week. And I thought it would be a really good idea to maybe translate that into watercolour. So I'll have a final piece in watercolour and oil, and I can compare the two mediums. Again, it's a really soft Saturn Who study, which is just down the road from my studio. I don't know if anyone's seen that film on Netflix, The Dig. Check it out if you haven't. But that's basically this landscape where I am now. So we'll work from this and then we'll see how we get on with the watercolour. So all I have here is some white paper. I'm not sure how it will be with watercolour. If it doesn't work, I've got different types of paper we can try. Remember, I haven't actually used watercolour for years, so this is a kind of re-entry for myself as well into kind of using it. Using a porcelain plate is kind of a traditional way to see the colour at its best and brightest. So I also have a squirrel brush. This is one I've used only once before, so we'll see. It's a kind of traditional, I wanted to go for the traditional brush strokes, like to see how they would have done it in history. So the composition again is that light source here, and then 3 trees just at the bottom of the horizon. I'll just roughly sketch out where I want those to be. Okay, so what colours to use? I think we should just start with the lighter colours. Okay, so start with the yellows, the light, and then work into it with the kind of greens of the trees, the pinks of the sunset. So Indian yellow. Wow. Rose door. Whoa, these are like oils. They don't look like watercolour. You see why the white porcelain's helpful. Okay, so water colour. If I remember correctly, it's washes of colour, isn't it? So Michael said that you didn't have to use too much medium. He wants these to feel like they're oils. I love the kind of reaction when it blends with the water. It kind of feels like it has a life of its own. Let's try a slightly less wet approach just to dust the area. Remember, I haven't done this for years. It's just an experiment, but I think the key thing is letting each layer dry. Some watercolorists usually use hair dryers, so as they're going, they're just drying everything.
Want me to go and get your hairdryer?
I don't have a hairdryer. Okay, so this paper is actually oil paper, which means it repels water. It's been sized and primed, so it is like, you can almost see the water like balls bobbling on the surface, not really taking to the paper. However, this paper was almost too absorbent and it started to kind of ripple and warp. So I'm gonna let that dry for a bit and just sort of experiment with the oil paper, just to see what happens really. And to any watercolorists out there who are cringing as they're watching this, I don't know how much water to use. I'm literally experimenting, and I'm sure I will get better with time, but please forgive me as I stumble and make a massive mess through this.
As long as you're genuine and you're not. What have you done?
Sprayed everywhere. Look how far it goes. I wouldn't know that that's watercolour.
Maybe you should do a collaboration with a watercolour.
An actual watercolourist who knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
Who are cringing as they're watching this. I'm just going to use my oil brushes. See, okay, if I use it like oil, it's actually much easier. Looks like a Christmas tree. Yeah, they're incredible, these watercolours. And they do act like oil. I just think it is a new skill that I just have to like patiently, it's like going back to learning again. And it does behave slightly differently to oil, but I actually think if I'm more confident with how I use colour, it makes some really interesting paintings. I have a whole new respect for artists like Constable and Turner who did beautiful watercolours for their skyscapes. I found actually that skies are really hard in watercolour and I've just been focusing on these kind of trees. It's going to be a work in progress. I am, again, not a watercolourist, so it's just about playing, isn't it? Go easy on me. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I am painfully aware that I am not using this incredible medium to the best advantage that it could offer me. I am using it like oil. I ended up just kind of slapping it on. Obviously my terrible first attempt was just a bit too wishy-washy. So there's obviously a happy medium where with watercolour you do washes of colour and you can create some really sensitive marks and work into it, and it could be incredibly, you know, delicate and exquisite. This is not that. This is like a moderately okay sketch, but I think if I do any more to it, I'm just going to get more and more frustrated. So Michael Harding has created the most amazing mediums, and I need to learn how to use them and get much better. But this is just a first attempt. Maybe I can teach myself how to be an amazing watercolorist, and as I teach myself, I can share what I am learning, and maybe we can all improve together. But maybe don't look at this too closely. Hey, these mediums are incredible. They act like the pigment is the same as oil. There's a really rich, heavy weight to them. They feel very bodily. They don't feel like you have to make a lot of effort to make the colour vibrant. Immediately it just pops. And I'm excited to try and get better at this. It's good to be kind of, you know, at the beginning of something and know that you have a long way to go. But look forward to the process. Oh God. I'm sure I could do something with that. I'm sure I could turn it into something. So thanks for watching this week's episode of Art Life. I think that's all we have time for. I'm sorry my first attempt at watercolour wasn't quite the masterpiece I planned, but I fully intend on improving and getting much better at using these amazing new watercolour mediums. If there are any watercolourists watching, I'd love it if you could leave in the comments below maybe a link or some kind of tutorials maybe that you found helpful for getting better at watercolour. So like and subscribe, and I will see you next Monday for more Art Life studio time. Bye.